video 1, you learnt that to establish a claim of negligence, 3 elements are necessary. Number 1, that the defendant owed the plaintiff a duty of care. Number 2, that the defendant breached this duty of care. And number 3, that the plaintiff suffered damage as a result of this breach of duty of care. In video 2, we examined the first element, duty of care. In this video, we will examine the second element of negligence, breach of a duty of care. A court will only consider this second element if the plaintiff has proved the first element, that the defendant owed the plaintiff a duty of care. To decide whether there has been a breach of duty or not, we look at the behaviour of the defendant. If the defendant has not taken the precautions a reasonable person would have taken in the circumstances, then it is likely that the defendant has breached his or her duty to the plaintiff. What a reasonable person would do in a particular circumstance is called the standard of care required in the situation. Queensland's Civil Liability Act 2003 sets out what must be considered when deciding what standard of care is owed in a particular situation. These factors include the probability that harm would occur, the seriousness of possible injury, the burden of taking precautions, the usefulness of the activity to society, whether the standard of care of the profession has been followed, whether the standard of care meets the requirements of relevant laws, any special circumstances of the plaintiff or defendant, and any other relevant factors. Each of these factors can raise or lower the standard of care needed in a particular situation. Now let's examine each of these factors. The first factor to consider is the probability that harm will occur. The greater the risk of injury in a particular situation, the higher the standard of care owed in that situation. For example, people driving cars on our roads owe a high standard of care because it is quite probable that harm will occur if these drivers are careless. The second factor to consider is the seriousness of possible injury. The more serious the possible injury, the higher the standard of care owed. For example, companies that offer bungee jumping owe a high standard of care because customers could get seriously injured if the bungee cord broke. The third factor to consider is the burden of taking precautions. Here the court asks, how costly and difficult would it have been for the defendant to take steps to prevent the injury from occurring? If it is easy to erect a sign warning of slippery floors, then the court says you must do this. But the court would not expect a cricket club to erect a high fence all the way around their cricket ground just to stop the rare occasions when a cricket ball is hit over 100 metres for a 6. The fourth factor to consider is the usefulness of the activity to society. For example, the law does not want to stop people from attempting to rescue someone drowning in the surf, so the law expects a lower standard of care from rescuers. The fifth factor to consider is whether the standard of the profession has been followed. For example, when a court is reviewing what a doctor did, the court will listen to evidence from other doctors to find out whether they would have done what the defendant doctor did in the situation. The sixth factor to consider is whether the standard of care meets the requirements of relevant laws. For example, the law says you cannot use your mobile phone while driving. So if you injure a pedestrian while doing this, it is likely you have not shown a reasonable standard of care. The seventh factor to consider is any special circumstances of the plaintiff and the defendant. For example, if the plaintiff is a child, then they are more likely to be injured in certain situations. So the standard of care when dealing with children is high. The court can consider other factors here, such as if there is a relationship of dependency between the plaintiff and the defendant. So the court will consider all of the above factors when deciding what standard of care was owed in a particular situation. If the defendant has met this standard of care, then he or she has not breached their duty of care. However, if the defendant has not met this standard, then they have not done what a reasonable person would do in this situation, and therefore he or she has breached their duty of care to the plaintiff. In our banana peel case, it was probable that someone would slip over if the defendant threw his banana peel on the ground. There was a risk of serious injury when the plaintiff slipped over, and the defendant could easily have put his banana peel in the rubbish bin. Therefore, the defendant owed the plaintiff a high standard of care, and his behaviour has not reached this standard, so the defendant has breached his duty of care to the plaintiff. Now check your understanding of the second element of negligence, breach of a duty of care, by completing negligence quiz number 3.